Welcome to SST8's PD On Demand. The intent of these webinars is for teacher-based teams, individual teachers, or building level teams to view and discuss this content while providing flexibility in meeting your professional development needs. For example, you may choose to chunk the content and break it up over multiple days, or you may wish to use it as part of a professional development day. This webinar will focus on the Understand, Diagnose, Take Action framework and how math teachers and teams can use the framework to plan for and design instruction that supports the learning needs of all students. To support your learning during this session, you will want to access the Understand, Diagnose, Take Action Mathematics Edition resource document to use throughout this training. So get your resource document, gather your team members, and let's get to it. As a participant in this webinar, you will be considering the role of the 3 shifts in mathematics: focus, coherence, and rigor in the Understand, Diagnose, Take Action framework. You will also be gaining knowledge of resources available to support designing instruction for unfinished learning and developing skills in designing instruction using the Understand, Diagnose, Take Action framework to meet the needs of all learners. It's important to note that when the Ohio Department of Education updated their learning standards to align to the Common Core standards, there were 3 major shifts that occurred within and among the standards. Those are focus, coherence, and rigor. These 3 shifts are key points to recall when understanding, diagnosing, and determining actions to take to address unfinished learning. The standards have critical areas of focus, intentional connections within and across grade levels, and they require students to be able to demonstrate conceptual understanding of mathematical topics, procedural skill and fluency in developing accuracy, efficiency, and flexibility, or what we call automaticity, with numerical facts and mathematical strategies, as well as the ability to apply their learning in situations where students can utilize their conceptual understanding and procedural skill and fluency in solving problems in new and different contexts. To assist with the first shift, which is focus, the Ohio Department of Education has documents that list the critical areas of focus for each grade level. For your reference, you can find the link to this page on your resource document. The second shift, coherence, describes how the standards were intentionally designed to help make sense of mathematics. These standards carefully connect learning within and across grade levels and depend on students gaining that conceptual knowledge of core content in order to extend their learning. Mathematics is built upon progressions and foundational knowledge. This is critical to know when attempting to diagnose some of those learning gaps. But this can also put us in a precarious position of meeting grade level expectations when thinking about how to address unfinished learning. And we are going to talk more about this when we dig deeper into the diagnosing and taking action in addressing unfinished learning in math. The third shift, rigor. It's a delicate balance between conceptual understanding, procedural skill and fluency, and application. Conceptual understanding is that knowledge of key concepts, such as place value and ratios. Students must be able to access concepts from multiple perspectives so that they are able to see math as more than a set of mnemonics, algorithms, or discrete procedures. Procedural skill and fluency calls for speed and accuracy in calculation. Students should be given opportunities to practice core functions such as single-digit multiplication so that they have access to more complex concepts and procedures. This calls for consistent practice with exercising repeated reasoning and opportunities to build that automaticity. It's the deliberate selection of problems distributed over time rather than in a single sitting. And these components of fluency once again include accuracy, efficiency, and flexibility. But one word of caution here. Fluency is not about timed tests, but rather developing an understanding of numbers. Joe Bowler tells us there are many good teaching strategies for encouraging fluency in math, but the ones that are effective are those that simultaneously develop number sense, the flexible use and understanding of numbers and quantities, without instilling fear and anxiety, which timed tests have been shown to do. Strategies that involve reasoning about numbers and operations, such as the pedagogical approach called number talks, are ideal for developing fluency with understanding. Beyond the fear and anxiety, timed tests also convey strong and negative messages about math, suggesting that math ability is measured by working quickly rather than thinking deeply and carefully, which is the hallmark of high-level mathematical thinking. And Kling in 2011 mentioned, if fluency is the goal, classroom instruction must emphasize the development and application of strategies. The more automaticity students have in recalling facts and procedures, the more working memory that is freed up to think about application and problem solving. Just as with fluency in reading, if a student is struggling with number facts and determining an efficient computational strategy, the less working memory that student has to think through the problem and apply prior knowledge. We need to help students develop those skills and strategies that will assist and support them in building automaticity and efficiency with numbers and facts, instead of stressing the idea that faster is better. As a resource for you and your team to consider, you will find a link to Joe Bowler's article from EdWeek in 2012 titled Timed Tests and the Development of Math Anxiety on your resource document. The third aspect of rigor, application, calls for students to be able to use math flexibly for an application in problem-solving contexts. In content areas outside of math, particularly science, students are given the opportunity to use math to make meaning of and access content. There are a few considerations regarding these three aspects of rigor to keep in mind. First, the three aspects of rigor are not always listed separately in the standards and materials. Conceptual understanding needs to underpin fluency work. Procedural skills and fluency can be practiced in the context of applications. And applications can build that conceptual understanding. But on the other hand, the three aspects of rigor are not always together in standards and materials either. Fluency does require dedicated practice over time to that end. And rich applications cannot always be shoehorned into your mathematical topic of the day. And conceptual understanding will not come along for free unless it is explicitly taught. So at this time, get your resource document and find the time to process section. Pause the webinar and use this time to think and process individually and as a team about what you're thinking in regards to the 3 shifts in mathematics. There is space on your resource document to capture ideas and notes that you want to remember from your conversation. And then when you are ready to move on, please resume the video. So before we move forward, let's go back and recall the 3 concepts in our approach to addressing unfinished learning. We need to understand and have clarity regarding the standards. We also need to be able to diagnose where gaps in learning appear, and if those gaps exist for individual students, small groups of students, or for the entire class. And then we need to decide upon a course of action to address that unfinished learning. Can you build scaffolding into your core instruction? Or will some students be best served with additional time and practice in an intervention setting in addition to your core instruction? So let's begin with that understand section. When we look a little closer at this part of the framework, you can see that it focuses on studying the standards for clarity around student learning outcomes. You and your team will need to be able to study and deconstruct standards for clarity, determine prerequisite skills needed to access grade level standards, and know those connections within and across grade level standards. Understanding needs to take into consideration first and foremost the grade level standards. But you should also be considering the extended standards, ODE's model curriculum, as well as testing specifications. All of these resources will help you to gain clarity around the standard and what to teach. When studying the standards, it is essential to consider when to utilize the extended standards to provide students an entry point and access to grade level expectations, and when to go back in the grade level progressions to pick up some of those foundational skills to assist and support student learning of grade level standards. You will find links to each of these resources on the resource document for this webinar. I'm going to discuss and show you each of these resources as they relate to the 5th grade standard shown on this slide. This standard is in the numbers and operations fraction domain in cluster A, and the aspect of rigor in this standard is procedural skill and fluency. Standard 5 NFA 1 states that students should be able to add and subtract fractions with unlike denominators, including mixed numbers, by replacing given fractions with equivalent fractions in such a way as to produce an equivalent sum or difference of fractions with like denominators. So let's start with the extended standards from the Ohio Department of Education's website. We can see that there are a number of learning progressions along that right-hand side that students need in order to be able to meet the standard. And then you can see the scaffolding of complexities focused around denominators that are evident in the document as we move from complexity C to the left toward the full grade level standard. Take a moment now to pause the webinar and then discuss this learning progression and the complexity levels. As an alternative, you may choose to open the extended standards, locate a standard that you and or your team will be teaching in an upcoming lesson, and you might want to discuss the learning progressions and complexity levels of that standard. You will find a section on your resource document where you can take notes regarding your discussion. When you are ready to move on, resume the webinar. An additional resource that you may find helpful as you look to gain clarity around the standards are the model curriculum documents, also on ODE's website. In these documents, you will find expectations for learning centered around the domains and clusters of the standards. you will see that the model curriculum also includes content elaborations. And on the next slides, you will see that the model curriculum also includes instructional strategies, resources and tools, misconceptions to be aware of, and the connections across and among grade levels to support your understanding of the standard. So take note on this slide of the instructional strategies listed in this model curriculum document. The document continues with providing resources and statements regarding student misconceptions with adding fractions with unlike denominators. And here we can see the connections between other standards in 5th grade and connections to the 3rd grade standard. At this time, you may wish to go back and pause the video to look more in depth at each of the previous slides regarding the model curriculum of this particular 5th grade standard, or pause here to take some time to access the model curriculum document for the standard that you and your team have chosen to study, and then note some ideas on your resource document. Whichever you choose, when you are ready to move on, resume the webinar. As you continue to gain clarity around the standards, accessing the test specifications from the testing portal may also help you gain an understanding of the expectations of the standards. You will see any content limits and depth of knowledge levels that are considered when developing test questions. So pause the video now to locate your grade level test specifications using the link in your resources section of your resource document. Either bookmark or print out a copy, but then talk with your team about what you notice and wonder, and then note your ideas from your conversation on your resource document. When you're ready to move on, press play. As you are gaining clarity around the standards, here are a few questions that you and your team may be wondering about. 1, is it knowledge within the grade level standard that is presenting some unfinished learning? Or 2, is it a foundational knowledge that comes from a previous grade level standard that is inhibiting finishing learning? And then 3, how do you determine which, while keeping in mind that meeting the grade level standard is the ultimate goal? Let's take a look at one additional resource that you may wish to use to assist you in determining just what might be needed to help you with your decision making. We are going to investigate the coherence map on the Achieve the Core website. This resource will show the connections between and across grade level standards and provide tasks, lessons, and assessment questions specific to each standard. So first, find the coherence map link on your resource document and go to the site. You may get a few notifications explaining the design of the tool when you first navigate the site. Once you get to the site, you can choose the grade level, then the domain and standard that you and your team have chosen to study during this webinar. Or you can continue to use the 5th grade standard that we have been using, which is what you see on the slide. You will want to note that you can see the standards that lead to the current standard, as well as which standards are going to build upon this current standard. So at this time, pause the webinar and take some time to dig into that coherence map and the standard that you have chosen. And when you're ready to continue, resume the webinar. So now that you've really taken a closer look at the standards and examined grade level expectations for students, let's move on to the next part of the framework, and that's the diagnosing part, where we're going to talk about designing lessons that support diverse learners. Just as a doctor would ask about symptoms and run tests when making a diagnosis, you need to think about what your formal and informal assessment data is telling you about your students. And if you don't have enough data to make an informed decision, what other information do you need and how are you going to get it? There are different types of data and information we have to help us diagnose where our students are in terms of meeting the complexity of the standards. Does your formal data, such as benchmark, summative, and formative data, and your informal data, like student work samples, in-class discussions and observations, as well as one-on-one conversations, do all of these give you a complete picture? Can you determine if a specific student, a small group of students, or the entire class is missing a skill or some of that prerequisite knowledge? And how far back do you need to go to support students in accessing grade level content? Can you fill in a gap with a brief review before moving on with the lesson? Or do you need to teach a foundational skill, possibly from a previous grade level, to the entire class? What other types of information do you have that may help you to make decisions regarding lesson planning? Remember, the key here is to provide access for all students to grade level content and expectations. Does the entire class need to go back in order to move forward? Or can you build in scaffolds and entry points for the students that need a little boost? Also, recall that additional time and practice can be provided during an intervention or enrichment period for any students that might need that extra attention. So let's take some time now to begin to diagnose some unfinished learning using the information you gathered about the standard you chose in the Understand section. On your resource document, you will see a chart to use to assist you in diagnosing gaps using the resources we reviewed in the previous section. In this chart, you can begin to determine needs for specific students as well as for groups of students. Be sure to consider the extended standards and the learning progressions. During this step of the framework, you, your team, and the intervention specialist can begin to consider scaffolds that would be appropriate for different groups of students. The power here, though, is in the conversation that this chart provides for you and your team. Don't think about filling in all of the boxes, but rather consider what needs you've diagnosed and the best way to approach teaching and learning for maximum student learning and impact. This is where you begin to develop your instructional plan, determine the best approach and strategies for student learning and student needs, and design your lesson to meet the needs of all students. At this time, once again, pause the video and have a conversation with your team to discuss what assessment data you have collected, what data might be missing, what information you have about student unfinished learning, and where students might fall along the continuum complexity of the standard. You might also begin discussions on subskills or learning progressions, as well as scaffolds. When you and your team are ready to move to the take action step of the framework, resume the video. You have now studied a standard, discussed the data you have collected to diagnose unfinished learning, and begun to think about what actions you could take to impact learning for all students. During the take action step of this framework, you really begin to determine what the support is going to look like. Will you provide support in class during core instruction? Will you also be providing support during intervention period? And who needs this support? And how does all of this support connect to the grade level standard? As you ponder those questions, let's take a look at some common missteps. All of us at one time or another have probably made a few of these missteps in the process of doing what was best for our students. I know I have. Let's consider these missteps and the recommendations for how we can work smarter in helping all students master grade level standards. At this time, locate the section labeled Take Action on your resource document. As an individual or a team, choose 2 actions under the missteps column that might be actions that you or your team would like to consider adapting, and put a star next to those 2 missteps. Then, under the before column, write down key points of your discussion around these 2 missteps that are true for your team. And in the next column, write down thoughts and ideas that you and your team have on ways to adapt to the recommendations listed in the chart for your 2 specific identified missteps. Pause the webinar now to complete this, and when you have finished your discussion, resume to continue. So let's take one of these specific missteps and recommendations and look a little closer. Reteaching versus repeating. If we continue to do the same thing and use the same strategies, and student performance is not changing, then we as the adults need to do something differently. We cannot expect changes in student performance without changes in adult practices. It is similar to Einstein's definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. As an individual and a team, you need to ask yourselves this question: is the help helping? If you are working on helping students to learn number facts by using flashcards, drill sheets, games, and memorizing, and they aren't helping, then stop. You and your students will both breathe a sigh of relief. Consider using the coherence map, spaced practice, and teaching alternate strategies to support students with this task. Stressing students out and having them develop a math anxiety will not lead to improved outcomes. So when we think about taking action in the classroom, let's consider some do's and don'ts. And let's start with what not to do. Don't group students by disability or deficit. Provide that inclusive environment for all your students. And don't think you have to plan alone or have all the answers. Don't be shy to observe your peers to learn from them, or be hesitant to invite colleagues into your classroom to learn from you. You have a professional learning network right at your fingertips. And don't continue doing the same thing and expect different results. If you want to change, then be the change agent. Be daring and do something different. Both you and your students will be glad you did. Now, what can you do? Well, do continue to look at your standards prior to planning your lessons. Your clarity around the standards will provide you that boost in getting straight to the important foundational stuff in the standards. Make sure you're speaking with your colleagues during planning and ask for input. None of us have all of the answers. And be sure to clue students into what they're learning, why it's important, and where they are in meeting those learning intentions. The more information that those students have, the more likely they are to move toward the target. And most importantly, remember that what you do matters. And it matters a lot. You are the most important factor in student learning. At this time, find the Time to Process section on your resource document, and take a few minutes to record your thoughts. Consider what you've learned during this webinar and one action you might want to implement moving forward. When you have finished documenting your thoughts, resume the webinar. So please know, these superheroes aren't coming to your classroom, but there is you. This is hard work, but you can do hard things. Your superpower is that you are a teacher. I know what you're probably thinking right now. Well, this might be the right thing to do, but when can I possibly do all of this? I am at my limit, and I couldn't possibly plan like this for every lesson. You know what? You're right, you can't. But remember, you don't have to do this alone. You don't have to do it all at once. And you don't have to have all of the answers. You just need to take that first step and start. Thank you so much for listening and learning along with me. And remember that you make a difference for all of your students every day.